One thing that I would point out about the microchips, so the microchips, those are actually a big deal. I had said this a couple of years ago and people kind of smirked, but it's like, no, seriously, these microchips are super important and people would go to war for them. And actually, you can look up Congressman McFall, who's one of just McCall. He's one of the worst hawks on China, but he accidentally said it on Meet the Press the other day. Like, why should we fight for Taiwan? Well, they have microchips. I mean, democracy. No, I mean, but the United States is very coordinatedly now trying to cut off Beijing's access to specific high-grade microchips and the technology, the lithographic technology needed to make them. And in the same way that the Roosevelt administration was ultimately able to provoke the Imperial Japanese government into a war by cutting them off from literal oil, this is the oil of the digital economy. And while China can make a lot of low-grade chips that go in things like smartphones and different things like that, I mean, we're talking about very specific advanced chips that go into, like, supercomputers, hypersonic missiles. So it's just another one of those areas where, it seems innocuous. You read it in the paper like, oh, Japan's going to put some export sanctions on these things. It's like, this is the stuff that wars are made of. This is how wars get made. So
yeah, I think that one of the people you just referred to, I'm not sure, but I've heard an official and an ex-official both say if China did invade Taiwan, they would bomb the semiconductor microchip factories, and they would not let them get their hands on it. I mean, they literally said it on TV. This ally of ours, if they get invaded, we will bomb them.
We'll bomb them. I know.
So that geopolitically it'd be a disaster if China took Taiwan. Number two, it goes to your point of the chips. 90% of our the small 5 nanometer and less chips, silicon chips, are made by TSMC in Taiwan. And if China has not been able to replicate that industry, unlike many other industries that they've been able to replicate in their own country, if they got control of those TSMC factories and research facilities, they'd be the new OPEC of silicon chips and control the world economy. Now, let's face it, that's never going to happen. I mean, the United States and its allies are never going to let those factories fall into Chinese hands, even if there was a successful invasion of Taiwan. I mean, you're looking at something similar to what happened with the French fleet when Vichy France surrendered to Germany. The Brits didn't allow the French fleet to remain intact so that it could have potentially gone to the Germans and changed the balance of power in the battle for the Atlantic. So
they bombed that fleet.
That fleet was destroyed, and it was like Churchill walked into the House of Commons. He was a Francophile with tears streaming down his face because it was the hardest decision he made in the war. And yet he was greeted by unanimous applause as he entered the House because they understood how important that was to the future of Great Britain and the ability to continue the struggle against Nazi Germany. And again, I think you'd have a very similar situation here. I don't think TSMC factories, research facilities, things of that nature fall into the Chinese hands, even if they were somehow successful in the invasion.
They would be gone, is what you're saying. They would be gone if the Chinese successfully took Taiwan. Those facilities and production capacity would be gone. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
I can't imagine they'd be intact.
That's fascinating.
This gets back to sort of using deterrence, and how does the chip sort of policies that the U.S. adopts create a deterrence?
Well, I mean, this is one of the interesting ideas that's floated out there for deterrence is just making it very clear to the Chinese that if you invade Taiwan, we're going to blow up TSMC. I just throw that out not because that's necessarily the best strategy, but because it's an example of debate that's out there. And of course, the Taiwanese really don't like this idea, right? So as we think through what this strategy needs to be, we've got to think again about the sort of second and third order implications here of where this leads us. Are we fostering a very successful domestic Chinese chip industry that's eventually going to catch up to where we are, or are we adequately controlling, and sort of keeping them, keeping that lead that Chris just described in place? These are some of the questions that I think we're struggling to answer as we figure out what this economic.
Can I have a little inter-party dispute here on the blowing up TSMC? If you do that, you have a $2 trillion economic impact on the global economy within the first year, and you'd put manufacturing around the world at a standstill. I mean, this is a terrible idea.
I'm not promoting the idea. I'm not promoting the idea, Michelle.
You're just saying making the threat.
What I'm saying is these are some of the things that are actually actively being debated amongst U.S. Policymakers. And by the way, if China takes over TSMC, whether it's a Hong Kong style takeover or they take over it by actually invading it and actually able to capture this thing intact, we could very well face the same level of economic consequences, not globally, but for the United States.